Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. It's been a year since we first took an extended look at the White House's so-called war on whistleblowers, and the story has developed in significant ways. First, Edward Snowden, the former security analyst who revealed the sweeping Orwellian extent of the NSA surveillance program, became the seventh whistleblower to be charged by the Obama administration under the Espionage Act. That's more than double the number of prosecutions of all previous presidential administrations combined. Then Bradley Manning, the self-confessed source of confidential documents given to WikiLeaks, was convicted on most of the charges brought against him. The coverage of the two cases in the mainstream U.S. media has been, to say the least, interesting. Not only did Snowden and Manning have their character, motives, and loyalty called into question by reporters and news anchors, the legitimacy of the journalists they leaked their information to was also challenged. All of this occurred while U.S. news organizations, the Associated Press, and Fox News learned that they had been under government surveillance over some of their reporting on national security issues. Then, after months of pressure, President Obama announced a review of Washington's surveillance of Americans, their phone records, and their emails. In the second half of this program, we have an extended interview with Matthew Miller. He's the former public relations director at the Department of Justice, and he defends the prosecution of government leakers. But first, the continuing crackdown on whistleblowers in Barack Obama's America.
The Obama administration has gone after national security leaks and whistleblowers with a vindictive fury not seen since the days of Richard Milhouse Nixon.
And they came into government saying they'd be the most transparent administration. Instead, we've seen more attacks against journalism.
I think it's utterly a case of shoot the messenger.
And this is more than a chilling effect. This is dumping a truckload of liquid nitrogen on journalism.
Let me know when you get it.
It is a common misconception that the enormous intelligence leaks engineered by Bradley Manning and then Edward Snowden that filled front pages and outraged official Washington are primarily the result of technological advances. The technology is central to the story, but is not, in and of itself, causal. It is far more complicated than that.
Well, what happened is, after 9/11, there was an investigation, and the United States government found that one of the reasons it happened is because we didn't connect the dots. There was not enough information being shared between agencies like the CIA, the FBI, the military.
So they said the solution is to increase information sharing. So what that did was create a lot more access by a lot more people. There are now over 4.8 million people with security clearances in this country. So the number of people in this secret community has expanded significantly. The number of secrets have expanded significantly. So what we've seen is this explosive growth in the number of classified documents.
So one of the reasons we have so much information right now that's accessible, and people like Bradley Manning had it, people like Edward Snowden had access to it, is because we want to connect the dots in the future. So right now there's an overclassification of material and too many people have access to it.
Manning can download in a matter of minutes hundreds of thousands of documents and put them on a little stick, put them in his pocket, go to Maryland on holiday from the military and upload to WikiLeaks from a Barnes & Noble store. That's what he did. It's that easy. So when you have that extent of capacity to leak among 5 million people, you know the American government has a problem.
Rather than changing its approach to classification and the connecting of dots of intelligence, the Obama White House has gone after the Mannings, the Snowdens, and 5 other government employees over security leaks. And the administration's zeal has spilled onto news organizations working those kinds of stories. It didn't charge the AP and Fox News, but the Justice Department did seize months of AP phone records and also issued an affidavit that described a Fox reporter who was working on a story about North Korea as a criminal co-conspirator. Any potential leaker with a story to tell, any news organization with a story to report, will have seen those developments as chilling.
There has been a chilling effect with journalists in the United States, basically because of the Justice Department going after the Associated Press and James Rosen at Fox News. I think we ought to be very concerned about that. You know, there's a fine line between going after leakers and trying to stop government officials from talking to the media and going after media themselves. So I'd say the Obama administration is right to crack down on people like Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning, but not right to crack down on the press themselves.
And it is a threat to the press, because without whistleblowing, if you ask anybody in Washington or anywhere else, tremendous amount of news comes out of leaks from the government and whistleblowing. So if you want to see a chilling message to journalists, it's the WikiLeaks case, it's the James Risen case, it's the James Rosen case. And for whistleblowers, it's Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden.
You have the New York Times' Jim Risen forced to testify on who his sources were. You have Fox News' James Rosen being named as an unindicted co-conspirator in another leaks. And you have the DOJ going through the phone records of the Associated Press. You know, this makes for lousy journalism. Lousy journalism carries real consequences. When the media doesn't report and probe into what is actually going on, you find yourself with 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. You find yourself invading Iraq in a war with no strategic or humanitarian gains, but with a lot of dead bodies.
Most of the Obama administration's wrath has been on the leaker, but they have been increasingly straying into the realm of hinting at prosecutions of journalists. I think they'll find that very difficult to go much further with, because at that point, the media does wake up. It starts to complain, and when you get the media acting together, it's a very powerful force. So I don't think they'll go far in trying to criminalize established media. What they will try and do is force a rift between establishment media outlets, New York Times, Guardian, Washington Post, and new-style digital outlets like WikiLeaks.
That the government would shoot the media messenger should surprise no one. That is a time-dishonored tradition the world over. However, prominent voices in the mainstream media have also taken issue not only with the whistleblowers.
Say, look at that guy. You guy's a weasel.
But also with the journalists associated with them. Julian Assange over Bradley Manning, and The Guardian's Glenn Greenwald, who broke the Snowden story.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
I can't think of anything that Glenn Greenwald has done that should get him attacked. You hear people call him, or some of these other journalists call him, he's an activist journalist, has an opinion. What does that mean? Every journalist who writes has an opinion. That's why we have some papers that we call progressive, some that we call center, and some that we call to the right. Because every journalist does have an opinion, even though they claim they're reporting the facts in every single situation. So Glenn Greenwald is clearly a case of shoot the messenger. He's probably, I think right now, the most important reporter in the United States, if not the world, for what he has done.
It's been especially grotesque in the United States seeing somebody like TV host David Gregory question Glenn Greenwald to his face whether he's a real journalist.
Well, the question of who's a journalist may be up to a debate with regard to what you're doing.
Grotesque because what story has David Gregory ever broken in his entire life? What bit of reporting, important news reporting, has he ever done? I mean, he's the ultimate in Washington insidery uselessness. And I think a great many people recognize this. Whereas Glenn Greenwald, because he writes in a column format and he started out in a blog format, that somehow marginalizes him. That's where most of the stories are being broken in the United States today.
The reason the media is so disparaging in these cases is first because I think they're frightened of their own role as the guardians at the gate of what this country ought to read. That seems to me a big reason. They're frightened by the fact that here are these young people coming out and undercutting the messages they want to give. The second thing, oftentimes, of course, media is controlled by major corporations that own the media, controlled by advertising, which then controls the messages, and they toe the party line. It's very rare that they don't.
The corporate factor is in play, as it usually is with the American media, but this story begins and ends with the White House. And its actions over the past 2 months belie its casual public downplaying of its approach to whistleblowers and the news media. After the AP and Fox stories came out, Attorney General Eric Holder issued new guidelines for the Justice Department. Post-Edward Snowden, the president announced a wide-scale review of his policies on domestic surveillance. And Obama has also talked up a media shield law he first tried to introduce in 2009. Do the administration's critics see this as an about-face? Hardly.
The Obama administration has clearly realized it stepped on some toes in the media, and it's responded by dusting off the new media shield law. But really, this is a poison gift that should be rejected. First of all, there's a huge carve-out for national security journalism, where they are not covered by it. And second of all, the law is very clear about who's a journalist and who isn't. And you can bet that anyone who's online or an organization like WikiLeaks, the government will make it very clear that that's not considered real journalism under the law.
And when the rules start to define a journalist narrowly, we get into trouble, particularly with the way traditional media is changed over the last 10 years. We want to make sure that every blogger, every organization that's in the business of compiling information for public consumption is protected.
And the president they want to protect the media from is Barack Obama, who promised the most transparent administration in American history. Their hope is he will change. Our Global Village Voices now on the Obama administration's crackdown on whistleblowers.
It is quite apparent the Obama administration has thrown the book at Manning in an attempt to silence whistleblowers everywhere. The effect on investigative reporting has been immediate and chilling. Anonymous sources are vital to reporters. Think about Watergate. The misdeeds of President Richard Nixon would never have been exposed without Deep Throat. The media in this country has done a grossly inadequate job of covering the case. The Manning trial has received far more attention abroad than it has in the United States.
There's been a divide created between journalists and sources, and it's going to be a lot harder to cover national security issues, and it appears that that's what the Obama administration and Justice Department have wanted, and why they've used Bradley Manning as their poster boy for a mechanism of intimidation.
Journalism is on its knees in the United States, and people don't seem to really care. That's a sad secondary revelation to the Snowden affair. A good man did do something in the face of what is a very modern evil, the complete subjugation of privacy. What have we come to when whistleblowers are left to do the job of journalists because journalists are too afraid?
We've outlined the case against the White House's prosecution of whistleblowers. Now we speak with someone who offers an articulate argument from the opposing side. Matthew Miller was the Director of Public Affairs at the Department of Justice. He served as Attorney General Eric Holder's spokesperson during President Obama's first 2 years in office. Last year, he wrote a piece defending the administration's approach to those who leak classified information. He said, "It is easy to understand why the press resists leak prosecutions so strenuously. Reporters' jobs depend on unearthing government secrets, and they often make our nation stronger by doing so. But some things are secret for a reason. And when government employees violate the law to disclose information that undermines our national security, there must be consequences." He spoke to us from our bureau in Washington. The last time we had you on this program, we discussed the Manning case, the WikiLeaks phenomenon, the Thomas Drake case at the NSA, other prosecutions that were taking place under the Espionage Act. You had just written a piece defending the administration's approach. Since then, we've seen the Department of Justice gathering surveillance information on the Associated Press, investigating Fox. We've seen New York Times reporter James Risen called to testify on his sources. Now Edward Snowden on the run from American justice. Are you still a backer of the administration's approach on these issues?
Absolutely, and I think you have to separate. There are a couple of different issues that get entwined here. One is the prosecution of national security officials who took an oath to protect classified information and broke that oath and broke the law, and when that happens, the government prosecutes them, and I think they're well within their rights to do so. And then there are more complicated questions about the freedom of the press that are raised when the government subpoenas journalist records and subpoenas either emails or phone records. And that's a much more difficult question. It raises all kinds of constitutional questions here. And I think the government did get a little out of balance in the way they approached those issues, and they've acknowledged that and put some reforms into place to address them.
Well, oaths matter, but this administration, like many before it, leaks like a sieve. There are leaks coming out of there on security matters all the time. They were leaking material that was classified at a higher level than anything that Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden leaked. So what about that double standard?
Some of the stuff that Snowden leaked was was very serious and potentially very harmful to national security. But that being said, there are too many leaks in the government. There are leaks that shouldn't happen. They happen all the time, some authorized, some unauthorized. And it does make it tough for, for the people where I used to work, the Justice Department that's in charge of prosecuting people for these. It makes it tough to decide when to go after them.
So if you think that the prosecution of Edward Snowden is justified, do you feel the same way about Glenn Greenwald, the reporter at The Guardian, who was the conduit for that information? Because he is, to the Snowden story, what Julian Assange was to the Manning story, wasn't he?
Yes, and no, I don't think he should be prosecuted. I don't think he ever will be prosecuted. In fact, the Attorney General has said that as long as he's Attorney General, no journalist will be prosecuted for doing their job. Now, you do get into sticky questions about who is a journalist. Glenn Greenwald, of course, is. There are questions about whether Assange really is. But even aside from those questions, I think it's very hard to see someone being prosecuted for soliciting information, for publishing information.
Back to the Manning case for a minute. The military court at Fort Meade found Manning guilty on multiple charges. However, the judge did throw out testimony from the State Department officials who said that the leaked cables harmed U.S. diplomatic efforts. And the judge also acquitted Manning on that aiding the enemy charge. Pentagon officials who initially went on the record to say that what Manning revealed would endanger American lives overseas or the lives of American allies have since said that nobody came to any harm over those leaks. So what damage did Bradley Manning actually do?
I always question this argument because, we have laws. If you commit a crime, you are prosecuted for committing that crime, whether or not anyone is harmed or not. If you get pulled over for drunk driving, just because you didn't wreck your car into a schoolyard and kill 10 children, you're still prosecuted for driving drunk because it's reckless and you could have harmed someone. So just because no one was harmed doesn't mean someone couldn't have been harmed, and it also doesn't mean that one individual has the right to unilaterally decide what should and should not be public for the entire government. There are checks and balances in place to make those decisions, and it's just not appropriate for one individual to do that on their own.
Then there's the overall trend of the growth in secrecy in government, particularly in Washington. According to the NSA, in 2002, a little more than 11 million documents were classified. By 2009, that figure was up to 54 million. It's since grown. The U.S. government, it seems, has more and more secrets. Is that not part of the bigger picture here, the bigger problem?
It is a huge part of the bigger problem. The amount of secrecy since 2001 has grown. The national security apparatus since 2001 has grown. We've invested a lot more money in national security, both abroad and at home. And with that has come an increase in secrets, but it's out of hand. It's something that really needs to be dealt with in a more serious way than has been to date.
The bottom line on this administration when it comes to the protection of whistleblowers is that if a whistleblower reveals illegality or wrongdoing at a department like the Food and Drug Administration, which affects people, the government will protect that whistleblower. But anything on national security is where the administration draws the line. Are you, as an American, comfortable with that?
I think you have to differentiate between what's wrongdoing and what's controversial, because what's controversial isn't always necessarily wrong. So Edward Snowden might not agree with those programs, but the elected representatives of the United States government in all three branches have, and they've blessed them repeatedly. So while they may be controversial, and I think that that it's a worthy discussion to have, that doesn't mean there's actually any wrongdoing coming here. And it goes back to my point that it's why it's not appropriate for one individual by themselves to make a decision that has such far-reaching implications across the government and across the country.
So the approach is you're going to have to trust us on national security. That's what Washington is telling Americans. But if you go back to the Vietnam days, had Daniel Ellsberg not leaked the Pentagon Papers, had Americans had to trust General Westmoreland or their Secretary of Defense at the time who were telling them that the war was going swimmingly, U.S. soldiers might still be in Vietnam. The American people trusted their national security officials in 2001 and 2002 and 2003 on the run-up to the Iraq War, on weapons of mass destruction, on Saddam's imaginary non-existent links to al-Qaeda. Isn't trusting the government one of the problems that has led to America getting into these foreign quagmires in the first place?
There is always a tension here in these areas, and that's why we have a free press in this country. It's why we have journalists who aggressively cover the government, who ask questions all the time, and aren't shy about revealing what they believe to be wrongdoing or what they believe to be controversial, whether it's actually wrong or not. So,
but those journalists, sorry to interrupt, but those journalists need sources. And under the current environment, the chill, those sources are drying up.
Look, if you read the papers here every day, you see tough journalism holding the administration, holding both parties accountable. I hear this from journalists that there's been a chill in reporting, but you still see tough national security reporting happening all the time. Good journalists are always going to find a way to reveal information. Look, I take your point. There is always a tension here, and it's tough to know, and you have to ask it in every situation when the right time is for a secret to become public. And in a situation like with Edward Snowden, I think there are a lot of us who've worked in the government who say it's very hard to understand why one individual takes on themselves this massive authority to publish programs that have really, in the government's mind, done a lot to keep the American people safe.
Well, possibly because some of those people feel that their conscience dictates that they do those things. People have said of Snowden that going up the chain of command is what he should have done. He shouldn't have gone outside, shouldn't have gone to the Guardian, should have gone to his superiors and said, hey, there's a problem here, and let's talk about it. But people like Thomas Drake at the National Security Agency, the very same agency that Snowden was at, say that they tried to go up the chain of command. They brought their concerns about illegality, about waste, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of taxpayers' money being wasted, and that you couldn't get a hearing, or those people were invested in the programs that someone like Drake and now Snowden, were interested in discussing. Is that not the case? Is that not the real problem, that the internal chain of command, let's climb up and discuss it inside, that doesn't work? That's why you've got to go outside to the meeting.
You do have to go outside sometimes, but there are avenues to do that without going up the chain of command. There's an inspector general at every agency that operates independent of the chain of command who you can bring concerns to. There are oversight committees in Congress who you can bring concerns to as a whistleblower. So yes, it's always very hard to bring things to the chain of command, but if whistleblowers do have real evidence of government wrongdoing, there are avenues to bring them to without going public. And I would say that when whistleblowers have brought public cases of wrongdoing in the past, and Tom Tam, the last administration, blowing the whistle on warrantless wiretapping, they often aren't prosecuted for those acts.
What about the media side of this story? Some people who know Snowden, they were asked, why didn't he take this story to the New York Times? And what they said is that Snowden was aware of what happened in 2004 when the Times had a story on warrantless wiretapping under the Bush administration. The administration asked the newspaper to hold that story off for reasons of national security. The Times held the story off until 2005, after President Bush was reelected. And what Snowden's friends are saying is that he didn't trust the Times, and he felt he had to take this story to an organization that's headquartered outside the U.S., The Guardian, to get it out into the news. And it's not something that Daniel Ellsberg ever had to do back in the day, but I'm wondering whether you, just as an American consumer of news, are at all troubled when you hear stories like that about, the newspaper that is supposed to publish all the news that's fit to print.
Let me speak to it as a former government official who's dealt with the New York Times on a number of things. I have never seen the New York Times willing to pull a punch on any administration unless they really believed there was a strong claim that it could hurt national security. And when I was at the Justice Department, there were a couple times I went to the New York Times and asked them to delay publishing something for a short period of time while an operation was underway. And they agreed because there was real harm that could benefit, and that's accountable journalism, and that's where sometimes governments and journalists can work together responsibly. But I think the idea that the Times would look to protect anyone in the government because of their reputation or because of the access they need to officials is ludicrous. I mean, that's just not how they operate there. They're tough, and they hold everyone they cover accountable.
Matt Miller, formerly of the U.S. Department of Justice, thanks for speaking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
That's our program for this week. Next week, we're back at it, analyzing news coverage all around the globe and helping you navigate your way through the world of modern media. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.